we have to proceed by positive ideals, things that are attractive. We have to find a way to make the disciplines attractive, each to the other, and to build in whatever way we can communities where people are talking to one another. And in that sense, I think I'm maybe, again, this feels so weird to say it, more pragmatic than I think. So I'm not interested in trying to impose a view of the unity of knowledge. I don't know what the unity of knowledge is. I have the sense that there's something, when I read a book and understand something about it, okay, there's a human being on one end and there's a human being on this end, and somehow we've understood each other. And of course, in a conversation with others, which is how we do things at St. John's, or how you would do it truthfully in any seminar room, you get together with other people and you figure things out. It's a form of human connection and human communication. And that's what, to me, testifies to the unity of knowledge, is the possibility of communication across disciplines.
Hey everyone, you're listening to Sacred and Profane Love, a podcast in which philosophers, theologians, and literary critics discuss how literature can help us think more deeply about love, happiness, and meaning in human life. As always, I'm your host, Jennifer Frey. I am an associate professor of philosophy at the University of South Carolina, and I'm also a faculty fellow at the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. So this is a special episode of the podcast because it was originally an event that took place at CUA in late April. The event was titled, Are the Humanities in Crisis? It's also the 50th episode of the podcast, which sort of feels like a milestone that's worth mentioning. I've been doing this since 2018, and finally made it to episode 50. And this episode is a conversation, basically, between Zena Hitz, Chad Wellmon, and myself. Zena and Chad have both been on the podcast before, but we got together to talk about some of the themes of Chad's most recent book, Permanent Crisis. This is a book that I wrote about in the Chronicle of Higher Education for their Best Academic Books of 2021 review. Now, if you're a patron of the podcast, then you might remember a conversation I had with Chad about the book for a patrons-only episode. And for what it's worth, I think it's definitely interesting to compare and contrast those two conversations. At any rate, I highly recommend Permanent Crisis and, of course, Lost in Thought, which is Zena's book, for anyone who's interested in the fate of the humanities in the United States at this historical moment. I have benefited enormously from reading both of these books. They're really different books, but in some ways, I think they complement one another nicely, and I think this conversation brings that out. As always, I would like to thank the IHE for underwriting this podcast and for hosting this event. I'm a full-time professor, I'm a mom, I'm a writer. There's absolutely no way I could continue to do this podcast without their critical support, for which I'm enormously grateful. To learn more about the IHE and the work that they do on human flourishing, you can go to their website, www.ihe.catholic.edu. And to learn more about this podcast, you can go to our new website. We are at www.sacredandprofanelove.com. On our website, you will find an archive of all of our past episodes and guests, and also a blog where we post news related to the work that we do. And of course, you can also follow the podcast on Twitter. Our handle is @eudimoniapod, and you can find me on Twitter. My handle is @JenFrey, and I'm also on Instagram @ProfessoressaFrey. And of course, if you would like to support this podcast yourself, just go to www.patreon.com/eudimoniapod. And you can support us for just $2 a month. Okay, with all that said, I hope you enjoy our conversation.
I'm Bradley Lewis, and on behalf of the Institute for Human Ecology, I want to welcome you to tonight's program, Are the Humanities in Crisis? The Institute for Human Ecology, as you know, is dedicated to the study of human flourishing in the light of the Catholic intellectual tradition. And we do this by supporting research in the humanities and social sciences, supporting graduate students who will carry this research forward into the future, and facilitating both scholarly communication and the dissemination of this research into the larger public through lectures and symposia and conferences. The valuable work of IHD is done by our fellows, some of whom you will meet this evening. One of our abiding concerns is to foster an appreciation and an understanding of human affairs in a non-reductive way. That is, to understand them precisely as human affairs. What we often call the humanities are therefore of the greatest interest because they constitute an aspect of the academy and of our larger cultural life integrally connected to human flourishing. The occasion for tonight's discussion is the appearance of what we think is a very important book, Permanent Crisis, The Humanities in a Disenchanted Age, by Chad Wellmon and Paul Reiter, published in 2021 by the University of Chicago Press. Our moderator this evening is well known to anyone who follows IHE events, Jennifer Frey. Jennifer is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Peter and Bonnie McCausland Fellow at the University of South Carolina. And she hosts a terrific podcast, which you have advertisements for there, called Sacred and Profane Love, which is run now to some 47 episodes and is sponsored by the Institute for Human Ecology. So with that, I turn things over to Professor Frey.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for coming out this evening, and welcome to a very special episode of Sacred and Profane Love. I'm so grateful to the Institute for Human Ecology for sponsoring my podcast. I certainly would not have continued podcasting without their support, and the podcast has been successful beyond my wildest dreams. So again, just very grateful to the IHE. And I'm so excited about this particular episode. First and foremost, because normally I podcast squirreled away in my teenage daughter's room, which is like the best soundproof room in our house. I'm not normally in such a lovely environment, and I don't normally get to chat with my guests in real life. But I am also just so excited to bring into conversation two people whose work on this topic I admire a great deal. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce my guests for this conversation. So Chad Wellmon is a professor of German studies with appointments in history and media studies at the University of Virginia, where he teaches and writes about the history of knowledge and information, the history of technology and universities, and media and social theory. He is co-director of UVA's new curriculum and principal of Brown College. He studied political theory at Davidson College and did his graduate work at UC Berkeley. And of course, he is the author of Permanent Crisis, which is a book that you should definitely read. And then my next guest is Zena Hitz, who is a tutor at St. John's College. Her book, Lost in Thought, The Hidden Pleasures of an Intellectual Life, which honestly, I love this book so much. Everyone should read this book and, of course, listen to the podcast episodes that I've done on this book. So her book, Lost in Thought, recently appeared in paperback from Princeton University Press. She gives lectures through the Thomistic Institute on themes of leisure and its necessity for human beings. Her scholarly work is on law, virtue, friendship, and human nature in Plato and Aristotle. And she also founded the Catherine Project and now serves as president of its board of directors. So thank you for joining me, Chad and Zena. I want to talk about this question, whether or not the humanities are in crisis. And I want to start just by inviting Chad to summarize kind of the main outline of your book, which I think it's just such a fascinating thesis. So I'll let you explain it rather than try to do it for you.
So very briefly, but first off, thanks so much for the invitation. Also, thanks for everything that you do, not only with the podcast, but your writing, your thinking, and you're just being in the world. And Zena, your book, if you haven't read it, obviously, read it this evening. I reread it over the weekend, and it's just so forcefully clarifying and compelling. So it's really great to be with the two of you here. So Permanent Crisis, the Humanities in a Disenchanted Age. I think the first thing I would say is it could be really quick reading because you have to grant me, you don't have to grant me a premise, and within the first 15 pages, you can stop if you don't grant that premise. But because it's pretty crucial. And the premise is something like the following, both in terms of scholarship, but also in terms of a broader readerly public imagination. The humanities, the continuity of the humanities is a project that stretches across millennia, that stretches across cultures, that stretches across institutions, most often imagined to stretch back to Greek and Roman antiquities of all sorts, and everything in between, with a great rebirth period in the Renaissance, has been greatly exaggerated. And this continuity has been exaggerated. And this gets us to the second part of not just the book, because that's just the first 15 pages. If you don't grant that, you can stop. No, they're continuous. To what we call, Paul and I call, the crisis of the modern humanities. And by modern humanities, we mean modern not in terms of a certain periodization, a certain time period, or even necessarily a temporal marker at all, but primarily a disposition. That's a certain present-mindedness, right? So the modern humanities are, in our lights, characterized by a certain present-mindedness, by which we mean, instead of taking as their object of concern disorderly desires, the trans-temporal ordering of intellectual desire, they're always wrapped up and pitted over against some contemporary problem. It's either in the late 19th century, the natural sciences, in the early 20th century in the United States, a certain vocationalism. It's the Soviet Union and the threat of technocratic hyper-organization in the Cold War. Today, it can be lots of things, neoliberalism, right? So the modern humanities, to our mind, are defined by a certain present-mindedness. And that's wrapped up with kind of the second part of the permanent crisis, and this is what the book really deals with, is that to our minds, the modern humanities are fundamentally an institutional project, right? The modern humanities don't refer to, or at least should not be conflated with, particular intellectual disciplines, particular intellectual practices. They're primarily an institutional organization. Think of it as an administrative unit, right? And this is their present-mindedness, call it reactionary, call it a rearguard project, was primarily, we argue, the fruit of the modern research university as it first crystallized in German universities, and then was expanded into this collective administrative unit in the first 3 or 4 decades in the United States in universities. So that should be the first thing. We're not talking about the permanent crisis of philosophy, the permanent crisis of literature per se, but something a bit more precise. The permanent crisis of an institutional project that first came to be called the humanities, at least in the United States, in the early 1930s, but especially in 1940s. But it first crystallized in the German context, and we can talk about this later. And for nearly a century now, claims about the crisis of the humanities haven't simply been laments or elegies. I think we want to say they've also been constitutive of the very humanities, this present-mindedness, this sense that the humanities are in crisis, but also paradoxically, perhaps, the only solution, that which can heal all of the problems invoked in the name of the present crisis, right? So it's this Freudian kind of dialectic where the things that we make are necessary to manage our lives, call them the humanities, but they also make us miserable. In short, that's the permanent crisis of the humanities.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so I mean, I'm very convinced with your thesis that there is something that we can call the modern humanities, and it does have this very specific institutional context, which you trace back to the rise of the modern research university, and sort of you tell a really fascinating story about how the humanities conceive of themselves over time, starting back at the rise of the research university. But I'm just wondering, what do you think, Zena?
Well, I also want to thank Jennifer for bringing us together, and the Institute for Humane Studies And it's great to be here. And I also want to thank Chad and Jen for bringing us together, because my book came out almost now 2 years ago, just running up on 2 years. And I've loved the reception, but it has been the reception that I've received directly has been almost universally positive. And it hasn't given me as much opportunity as I would like to really test and clarify and push to the limits the kinds of ideals that I talk about in the book. And Chad's book, I think, is significantly different enough from mine that there are disagreements. I might, in my own contrarian, combative tendency, trained in philosophy, I might exaggerate those clashes. Chad, in his irenic, more humanistic way, may try
irenic, no one's ever called that. I'll take it. Yeah, bring it.
Take it, yeah. Anyway, but to get to the point, so I was struck reading Chad's book, that one of the rhetorically powerful things about it is all of these quotes from professors, going back into the turn of the 18th century, saying the humanities are in crisis. And both he and Ryder do an excellent job of finding words and phrases and sentences from very different, what we think of as being a very different context, the 19th century German university or the early 20th century American university, where people are saying exactly the sorts of things they say now. The humanities are in crisis. And I think that I agree. So I'm going to first focus on the things which I think I agree with or there's an affinity with, and then I'll try to hone in on the disagreement, which might take a bit of time for us to work out among each other. The point of agreement, I think, is this, that the way that I describe intellectual life in Lost in Thought is as a human good or a set of human goods which exists in conflict with what I call the world, in quotation marks, the locus of competition, the struggle for status, the struggle for power, the struggle for money, and so on. So for me, intellectual life, which is broader than the humanities, I mean it also to include mathematics and science, and we might get to that, I hope, in this conversation, the connection between the types of knowledge, but that it requires the intellectual life for it to function, for it to provide the human good it's meant to do. It has to be withdrawn from concerns of status, of competition, and when it's taken that way and really undertaken as a form of an inner life, an individual, through which individuals can find their dignity, and through which, crucially, and this part of the view I think I've thought about more since the book came out, a way of connecting with other human beings. So intellectual life provides us with the ground for connecting with other people, with the rest of humanity. And I mean that in as general and as universal way as I could mean it. So if that's what intellectual life is like, and it is because the world and because our desires for the human good, our desires to learn and understand and to contemplate, these are in us. They're not just something that's out there in institutions. Because they're in us and because they are regularly built into virtually every human institution, there is constant crisis. There's constant struggle. There is always a necessity to remind oneself of the ideals, to clarify the ideals, to try to return to the ideals, to ask oneself whether the ideals are really doing their job. Is what I'm doing really for the good of my community or for myself, or have I given in to some kind of academic status climb, or am I, going on all these talks for the sake of the money, or whatever? There's ideological questions, there's political questions, there's various kinds of agendas which are always threatening to take over our intellectual work and our intellectual thinking. And so I think you should expect regular cycles of a sense of corruption, a sense of inauthenticity, a sense that we're fighting against forces which are outside of us. And that, I think, comes through very clearly in the book. So I think I agree that there is a permanent crisis in the humanities. The humanities are defined in some way by what they're not. But I think that that's part of their power and part of what makes them even more worthy of preservation. So the step which I think I don't take once we think the humanities are in crisis, the step that Chad takes that I would not take would be to say, well, look, clearly we keep calling it a crisis, so there's not really a crisis. Or we keep calling it a crisis, so let's dial back our expectations for what we should be getting out of the study of literature, the study of philosophy, or any of the humanities fields. Let's try to develop a more realistic point of view about what we're doing so that we're not just rising and falling on the sense of our living up to our ideals or our failure to live up to our ideals. And that I think is not right. So I think that the structure that Chad and Paul Reiter have noticed is a structure that belongs to any kind of idealistic living. It's not specific to the humanities, it's totally general. So I think about Christianity, for instance. Jesus says, love thy neighbor as thyself, and love thy enemies and bless those that hate them. Now, I think if you looked at Christian institutions in any particular time period, you would find numerous claims. People are not doing this. This is not loving your neighbor. This is not loving your enemy. We are failing to be Christians. Christianity isn't working. Christianity, like any religion, any serious attempt to live well for human beings, involves these kinds of conflicts between our ideals and our ability to live up to them, and our institutions' ability to live up to them. And that doesn't mean that they're not crucially important. In fact, I think it points to just how crucially important they are. So that's one way of putting this disagreement. Now, I'll just say one more thing in danger of soaking up all the time, that I think one of the things that one doesn't hear much in the discourse about the humanities these days, in academics' self-identification of themselves, and it certainly doesn't appear in at least the way Chad and Paul Reiter talk in their book about themselves. The humanities are for the sake of our happiness. Study is for the sake of the human good. It's for the sake of happiness. And that may not be neatly definable. It may evade our attempts to sort of define it and set boundaries about it. And we may, and especially since we live in, I think Chad's concerned about this, we live in a community that is pluralistic. There's a variety of points of view. There's a variety of sets of values. And our institutions have to belong to the whole community, our public institutions. So thinking about the human good, thinking about happiness, thinking about humanity and the good of humanity in that context is very challenging. But I do think it is absolutely necessary. And I think to encourage us to dial back our ideals or to lower our sights is a colossal mistake. I think the humanities have underpromised. Chad says they've overpromised, they've promised too much, they've promised to solve all our problems. I think we have not emphasized sufficiently that living by ideals, renewing our imaginations, learning the arts of understanding, these are what give us strength and power against all of the forces out there, whether they be forces from industrialization, forces from technology, forces from global corporate rule, whatever they are, however we want to define them. So that's in a nutshell, my disagreement. I hope I haven't gone on for too long.
No, not at all. I want to try to maybe sharpen the disagreement a little bit.
It's sufficiently sharp for me if you want to.
Well, maybe I want to sharpen the knife. I don't know. But yeah, so, I mean, just to bring out for listeners who haven't read Chad's book, it seems towards the end of your book, I mean, you have this historical account, which I found really fascinating and compelling, about how the modern humanities is something completely distinct from the traditional liberal arts. The liberal arts are the arts that make us free, and we study for its own sake and not for any utilitarian purpose. And then the kind of Renaissance conception of the humanities, that the modern humanities are something new, and that they are essentially related to the crisis of modernity, right? So their self-understanding as humanities comes to be that they're not the natural sciences, right? That they are also the place where people are going to find the things that modernity has made seem impossible or pushed to the corners. So like what is anything valuable? Does anything have meaning? Like, what's the story now about ourselves? Like, it's the job of the humanists, to give you purpose in an otherwise alienated and soul-crushing, modern, disenchanted hellscape. And so the claim that you kind of build towards at the end, because you do want to get away from crisis talk, it's not helpful. I'm not sure whether or not you want to get away from the modern humanities. That's a question I have for you that I hope you will answer. Because it seems to me that possibly you do, because if the modern humanities is essentially built up with crisis, then disentangling the crisis from the modern humanities might mean that the modern humanities itself ceases to be a thing. But, so you work yourself up to this position where you want to say, well, the humanities have oversold themselves, right? And this is where I think you sort of align yourself with Weber at the end. And of course, I want to hear the extent to which you align yourself with Weber in the end. But Weber famously argued that professors shouldn't be prophets or priests. They shouldn't, be imposing or indoctrinating values as part of educating university students. They should be dedicated to Wissenschaft, as Weber understands it, which is a kind of disciplinary, specialized knowledge, a kind of expertise, right, that has a sort of utilitarian value and that is connected to a somewhat peculiar account of progress. And that this kind of Weberian account, I think you think is more realistic. Possibly you think it's more valuable. I'm not really sure how closely you align yourself with this view. But then it's really clear how, Zena and I will be like, but no, no, actually, it's not that, or at least I'm not arguing that the professors should be prophets and priests. Priests should be priests. But we can't just be experts either. And especially as philosophers, expertise is not very appealing as a form of knowledge for us, because what on earth are we experts in? And for us, it's about something much more robust, like wisdom, right? And I certainly don't want to, I don't want to give that up. And I don't think that holding on to something more robust makes me a prophet or a priest, but just a philosophy professor. Mm-hmm. So anyway, sorry, that was a bit long, but maybe I'll just invite you to respond.
Yeah, I have a lot to talk about. So I'll choose a few things. I think, so first, Zena, I think what I would say something like the following, which is, I actually see, and I understand that this would have to be presented as an argument because it seems so not the case. I actually see permanent crisis as not just compatible with, but may I dare say, a companion piece to Lost in Thought for the following reason. Because I think the reason why I'm so worked up, the reason why I spent, how many ever pages and footnotes, and there's a reason for that, right? We could talk about the apparatus that is, University of Chicago book. And the reason I did that is because, for various autobiographical reasons, which we may or may not get into, is that my concern is what the humanities as a modern institutional project have done is precisely to constrain and deflect our capacity to attend to the reasons why I went to grad school or thought I did, the reasons why I continue to teach despite the overwhelming kind of bureaucratic value capture of the modern university. And the humanities, it's like a bait and switch, is that the humanities are a fixed function, as I see them, of a modern institution in which precisely those goods that both of you sing about beautifully are presented as those goods, but they're cordoned off, safely secured in administrative units, in forms of expertise. The philosopher as a professor, like that's an invention of the past 150, 200 years, right? That is a form of expertise, which Weber was even, philosophy as an expertise. I mean, that was still shocking, in 1917. So to me, this is funny to see how we understand ourselves in such, different ways. And I think that's part of what I'm trying to come to terms with, is that the modern humanities are a giant deflection apparatus in which we think we're, trying to read carefully, collectively. We think we're cultivating, subordinating ourselves to forms of an education, to that intellectual desire, which was kind of vague. I wanted to read. For me, I read because I wanted to get out of Western North Carolina. I went to Davidson, then I went to graduate school, and those reasons became something completely different. Some of those reasons became wonderfully different. They attained new shapes, right? I finally learned how to read with a certain amount of attention instead of like the 16-year-old Chad. You can only imagine. You think I'm gesticulating now as like reading all over everywhere. So I became a much more disciplined reader. But also, I feel like the goods with which I began, or I had in mind, the reasons why I began, were completely reformulated. They could be reformulated in terms of, as a faculty member, publications at a big public university, enrollment numbers because of anxieties about cash flows to departments. And our argument, conceptually and historically, is that was precisely what the project of the modern humanities was, because the beauty I see in Lost in Thought, or the beauty I see in a tradition which I sharply distinguish from the modern humanities, something like the Studia Humanitatis, right, of Petrarch, who was famously, is probably a certain form of apostasy, right, against the philosopher, the Aristotelian Middle Ages university curriculum. He was against those things precisely because his argument was that the goods of reading, the goods of rhetorical form, had been captured and cordoned off in a university and taken out of the commercial realm, taken out of the life of the diplomat. And the ways that you talk about those goods is what I would argue is precisely what I'm trying to say and give an account of how, why, and also the consequences of how those goods were taken into the university. And just think, I'll stop here, like a proto-figure before the humanities kind of even existed, Kant, 1798, his conflict of the faculty. What's going on there isn't arguing for a giant public discursive, to be anachronistic, Habermasian view of arguing in print. No, he's cordoning off and identifying by name those who get to engage in the play of reason, and they're a very small group within the philosophy faculty, which didn't even really exist. They're the only ones who get to enjoy what he calls the truth-seeking, because they have a responsibility over it, and it's its capture from what we might have imagined was a public sphere. To me, that's the real travesty. Maybe the idiosyncratic way of how I see permanent crisis as a companion piece, because all the things that I see you arguing for, we're deflected away from those things as we come to practice as certain shapes of expertise, someone with a PhD in German studies. I mean, what the heck? What is that? So that's what I would say. So that's a giant Hegelian bear hug. Right? I understand that, it's the reason. The reason I wrote the book is that at UVA we were in the seven-year general education curricular reform, and my colleagues couldn't make sense of the terms that we had so ready to hand, like the humanities, the sciences, and all those things. And it was a giant political brawl. And I was trying to understand, wait, these categories, do they bear any necessary relationship to the things we think we do as scholars and teachers?
So just to, I'm going to invite you to respond, but just to clarify, is that your way of saying, no, I'm not a Weberian, really?
Can I defer that question? Because that's a bigger question. I would say I'll come back to that.
Okay, but can I ask you? I mean, I have some thoughts. What you're saying is very interesting, but can you just clarify what you mean when you say the humanities have overpromised? What should they promise?
What they should promise is that a certain form of status and credential, which is what they are. That's what modern universities offer as modern institutions, right? Now, what happens, right? What happens in our classroom, what happens in our office hours, what happens hopefully in our work and writing, in my experience, is radically different from the prefix, preset values that a university as a modern bureaucratic institution can offer, can track, and can justify and legitimate.
Okay, so I think this is very interesting because I think I thought I was coming in as the idealist, but now
you have
now I feel like I'm going to turn into the realist. That's a little disorienting. So let me try to. That's not a place I normally find myself. On the one hand, I want to say I don't even believe in the humanities. What I believe is in the disciplines of understanding and the use of the imagination, which I think cut across all of the disciplines of knowledge, including mathematics and science. And I teach in a place that has no departments, where we have the opportunity to see how different arts of understanding, different modes of understanding, different disciplines of understanding interconnect with one another and can be seen as related human endeavors. Okay. So on the other hand, and I would like to see, I think like you, institutions which were recognize this type of activity as a human good, not a profession, but a human good. But I think this is true. This human good, like most human goods, it needs some kind of profession to safeguard it, to keep it, to preserve it, to pass it on. And I have no objection to there being institutions of that kind, even though I'm used to being the anarchist in the room. So I'm, but if Chad wants to be the anarchist, he can take the anarchist out. So I want to say that there's something reductive about the way, Chad, that you're talking about the institutions of the humanities. So on the one hand, I'd be the first to complain about the smallness of mind, the superficiality, the excessive use of political issues, all of the misunderstandings which are rife in the humanities disciplines as I know them. All of the ways in which it's done badly, all of the work that's done that isn't really worth doing. All of that is true. But I know that those institutions are safeguarding something. I know that there are teachers and students who engage in the disciplines of thought and learning and understanding, students whose lives are transformed by encounters with particular books or particular ways of thinking. I know that there is research that's done that is illuminating and important and enormously helpful for people who want to carry on these practices into the future. And I know also that as little as 25 years ago, when I was an undergraduate, we were doing better at having these practices spill out over into the broader culture. So I think, for instance, the mid-20th century, which I think gets kind of short shrift in permanent crisis, which is not to say it's perfect. And I'm actually not interested in nostalgia for its own sake. I'm interested in nostalgia for the sake of recovering ideals, which we can then live now. But I do think that, these people are very earnest. They talk about the human. They talk about the human good and the family of humanity. This is the age of the crisis of man, as Mark Greif puts it. Their earnestness, it seems to me, is something good. It's imperfect. It's corrupted sometimes, but it's good. And it spills over into the broader culture. So that I think about Huey Newton, who founded the Black Panthers. His brother, he didn't go to college. He graduated from high school virtually illiterate. That his brother went to college, and his brother Melvin left his copy of Plato's Republic lying around. And Huey Newton taught himself how to read by slowly reading Plato's Republic over and over again. Now, that's an example of something which, this isn't happening in a university. This is non-institutional learning, but it is somehow related to something that's happening in a university. And I think you dig into the 20th century or the 19th century, to the accounts of workmen's institutions, mechanics institutes, all of these grassroots intellectual organizations. And what you see is that work that is however badly, however incompetently safeguarded by the universities, it's making its way out and it's doing the thing it's supposed to do in the lives of ordinary people. And the danger now, which I know Jen will want to talk about too, we do live in a time of, I think, unique crisis. That is, it's not as if once the humanities institutions dry up from lack of funding or dry up from lack of students, it's not as if we're going to have this tremendous renaissance that happens there out in the world. We need those. It might happen. I hope it does. I pray to God it does. But what I think we might face instead is just a kind of desert for these kinds of study. And I think that would be, I'm not going to predict the future. I think it is a catastrophe whenever there are large swathes of our communities in these wealthy societies who are not acquainted with these types of learning and with the arts of understanding. It is a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe in a way that I was thinking, suppose someone didn't know what music was, and they found it on their Instagram feed and they're like, oh my gosh, wow, this is really cool. You would think something has gone wrong with us if we don't have institutions which promote music, build music, pass on music, do music to the highest level, and then which in some way radiate out into the broader culture. So anyway, that's my thought.
So I'm going to invite you to respond, but first I just maybe slightly reorient things. I don't know. But so I am interested, obviously, in higher institutions of learning, and with what right we call them higher. We know that they are higher in price, but that doesn't seem like the relevant sense of higher. But look, one thing that I am absolutely convinced by in your book, rightly or wrongly, I don't know, but I'm convinced that, the modern humanities is this institutional thing, right, that comes to be in a certain institutional context, and in particular, the rise and the development of the research university. And of course, one thing that's very interesting about this conversation that's happening right now is that you have two people who are at R1 research universities, and then you have someone who's at St. John's, which is a very different model of higher education. And so one question that I think we should be thinking about in a very serious way is the question about the extent to which the humanities can thrive in the research university as it is currently configured, where it just is a fact that I am not going to get tenure. I have tenure, thank God, but I'm not going to get tenure based on the public philosophy that I do or the glowing student evaluations I get or the lives my teaching has transformed. It is going to be a quantitative measure of my isolated research outputs, which will be evaluated by other experts on their contribution to knowledge, right? And that's the model. And if I want to get full, I better stop podcasting and start producing more Weberian Wissenschaft, right?
You just need to get somebody to put that in hardback, print out the transcript. It'll probably sell much better than Permanent Crisis, and you're fine.
Yeah, that's the thing. I was filling out my annual review in the airport on the way here, and I was in the airport with my department chair, and I had to keep asking him, wait, where do I put all of my writing from this year? Because it's not in academic journals. It's in stuff people read. And he was like, yeah.
Therein lies the problem.
He was like, okay, maybe in this section you should just naturally, because of course it's an online form. And nothing that I was doing over the past year was neatly fitting in any of the categories. And he's like, well, within this category, you can just subdivide and make your own categories and it'll make sense to people. But he's like, but make sure people know that thing you wrote in the point was 5,000 words, that it was somewhat serious. I'm like, okay.
It could be counted.
That's right, because otherwise it's not going to get counted. And so I guess, my question is, if the humanities are in crisis in the most basic sense that we don't have majors, our graduate students are depressed because they're pretty sure they're not getting jobs, our departments are being slashed, things feel very fraught and uncertain. If they're in crisis in that ordinary sense, or they're in crisis in the sense that they're in decline, right? To what extent do our institutions need to change, right? And should we be thinking about how our institutions should change such that maybe the modern humanities become something more like the traditional liberal arts, or maybe they become something else, something new? Yeah, I'm just wondering what you think.
Yeah, I mean, my contention would be, one, to stretch, I'm going to do the inverse of kind of the premise of the argument, into the catastrophe of which you spoke, Zena, is of a longer durée, right? It's early 19th century, mid-19th century, when all of these ways of valuing, of deciding how and what is worth valuing, the first ideas of publication as a marker of intellectual value. When Schelling in 19th century, before he came, in the 19th century, before he, moved to Berlin, when he, played several offers from different German universities off one of another. I mean, these things that are now make up the institutional air of universities, this is when they were being forged, right? I mean, in an attempt to make information and value portable across a giant Prussian bureaucracy. Like that's the in the weeds part of this argument, that the catastrophe was long baked in. It's baked into the institution. And my concern, to get to what I take to be kind of the motivation of your question, Jen, is that the humanities they weren't something that suffered from the onslaught of this. They were an intentional design of this project to cordon off questions of meaning and value into one part of a modern institution, such that, for example, the natural sciences could be let off the hook, right? We can put off questions of value and meaning, which is explicitly how it was, articulated in the German philosophy faculty. Was one faculty that included everything, from philology and history to physics and zoology, until, for many universities, well into the early part of the 20th century. But this idea of a unity of knowledge was something that kept coming very much under pressure. And one of the biggest kind of fissures was this question of, right, where are questions of value and meaning going to go? So for me, one of the biggest catastrophes is this obscuring, this occlusion of precisely the goods that we're talking about, and then settling them into one administrative department and unit that can be concerned with questions of value and meaning, while all the other forms of knowledge, the natural sciences, the physical sciences, the things whose use and utility can be much more publicly, i.e. in terms of the state, communicated, they can just go on doing what they're doing. So that, to me, that's one further catastrophe of this. One, we obscure the goods and we end up talking about something called the humanities, but what we're really talking about are, to my mind, I think, right, arts of understanding, as you put it, or intellectual practices and discipline that have a much broader, they break out of the university all the time, and they always have. The modern research university has tried to capture them for its own purposes, and because precisely they're arts of understanding, because precisely education both disciplines and liberates, you can't hold those goods back 100%. What we do in the classroom, hopefully sometimes what we write, those goods cannot be contained despite the efforts of this modern institution. So my concern is that we're precisely obscuring the goods and mistaking, like, oh, we got to defend the humanities. But like, what is the necessary relationship between, for example, the utter collapse of BAs, even at the University of Virginia, in English and history, not to mention German, over the past 5 years, we thought we were immune, and the goods that we're actually talking about? I'm submitting not much.
Do either of you think that a return to something like a substantive regulative ideal of the unity of knowledge right? So that rather than understand ourselves as working in the minds of our disciplinary silo so that we can produce these discrete, isolated products of knowledge that reflect our disciplinary expertise, if we had something more like the idea that in everything that we do as university professors, we are contributing to knowledge, right? Something that we think has to be coherent and unified such that whatever they're saying over in physics has to bear on whatever we're saying in philosophy and, other humanistic disciplines. I mean, this was something like Newman's idea of a university as contributing to universal knowledge in his sense. I mean, would some recovery of a regulative ideal of universal knowledge or the unity of knowledge, would that help?
So I think, okay, my mind is spinning with a lot of thoughts. I don't know what exactly is going to come out, but that's all right. I don't think that trying to organize, I think part of one of the pitfalls of the kind of thing that Chad describes in his book are these attempts to systematize knowledge and say, okay, there's this thing, the unity of knowledge, and we're pretty sure that its unity lies in this, and thereby the other disciplines are going to follow in this direction. I don't think we're really capable of doing that. I don't know whether we are in any context, and we certainly aren't in this pluralistic context where we are now. So for me, the question has always been about communication, that is, reading. I mean, one of the reasons why I love my job more than anything, I get to read these classics of mathematics and science. It's so interesting. Oh my gosh, it's so intellectually exciting. It's the best thing ever, okay? Now, I feel like if more people who were quote unquote in the humanities, like I am, I'm classics and philosophy, if they took an interest in them, I think it would be illuminating. I don't see anyone who has the authority to go to, say, a physics department and say, you know what, we've decided you're subordinate to philosophy. Like, you have to do things in a particular way. So we have to proceed by positive ideals, things that are attractive. We have to find a way to make the disciplines attractive, each to the other, and to build in whatever way we can communities where people are talking to one another. And so in that sense, I think I'm maybe, again, this feels so weird to say it, more pragmatic than I think. So I'm not interested in trying to impose a view of the unity of knowledge. I don't know what the unity of knowledge is. I have the sense that there's something, when I read a book and understand something about it, okay, there's a human being on one end and there's a human being on this end, and somehow we've understood each other. And of course, in a conversation with others, which is how we do things at St. John's, or how you would do it truthfully in any seminar room, you get together with other people and you figure things out. It's a form of human connection and human communication. And that's what, to me, testifies to the unity of knowledge, is the possibility of communication across disciplines, real communication, substantive communication. A lot of interdisciplinary things maybe don't meet that standard. And I object, I mean, I talk about it in the book, I object to focusing research universities, and especially in humanities departments, only on research. I think there should be more emphasis on teaching. I think the class sizes should be smaller. There's all kinds of material conditions and things that professors complain about, like the corporatization of universities, the use of sort of HR benchmarks to determine what counts as knowledge and so on. Okay, there's all kinds of complaints we could have, but I think that you fight with the army you have. So the question, I think, for us is, wherever each of us is, whether we're at an R1 university, whether we're at Catholic university, whether we're at St. John's, is, what can I do to make these activities as human goods real in my community? And I don't know whether I can say much more than that.
Right.
So, yeah, that's what I'm going to say.
Well, I'm going to exercise a lot of restraint for... do you want to respond?
Well, just because I think I hadn't thought about it like this. And so to shock myself and say, yeah, actually, I think I do believe in a unity of knowledge, not in a metaphysical sense, not in a taxonomic sense, but in the word you use, community, in an ethical sense. Because here's what I mean by that. I mentioned the curriculum reform, which this book was written, so it's autofiction of a Weberian sort, right? Detached and passionately detached. What I did for 5 years, and I didn't articulate it to various people at the time, was I spent 20 hours a week probably meeting with faculty across the university and my colleagues, and we had these huge knockdown, drag-out intellectual fights, is not trying to categorize knowledge in some kind of late 19th century neo-Kantian map, absolutely not, but trying to help them articulate what they never would have used language like this. But we don't quote Jefferson, we quote Aristotle, but my colleagues don't know that. And because what I saw my job as doing is to help, one, I was curious, I wanted to learn, but to help them understand what they're actually committed to, I would call the intrinsic goods, the goods internal to the doing of whatever discipline they're doing. They just don't call it that. So I go talk to the physicists, and it's not about how does that map up with some form of logic in the philosophy department. It's like, why do you do this? How do you understand the good things and the reasons that you're doing when you do this? Okay, here's what I heard. I'll come back. And then going from area to area to do it. Sometimes it mapped onto departments, sometimes it didn't. But what it forced us to do, and this is what made us, quote, a corporate body in that kind of Parisian sense, right? Universitas, was that we're all committed in some form of other to a whole array, this dappled array of goods internal to disciplined study and intellectual doing and exercises. And that's what we fight for, that's what we want to do, and that's what we aspire to do. And it just so happens that sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't map on to the institutional structure or even the institution in which that right now currently allows us to care and sustain those goods, and which is only relatively recent, right? And so my bet is that maybe those institutions will be otherwise and look differently.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think, and then I'm going to open it up to audience questions, but I actually think the way that you articulated the unity of knowledge is not so far off from Newman. But we can talk about that later because I'm obsessed with it. But now I do want to, I don't normally do this in my podcast, but obviously this isn't a normal podcast. This is like a supercharged episode. So I just want to invite anyone from the audience to ask a question and to continue the conversation. So if you have a question, just raise your hand. Yes, in the back. So what you need to do actually is walk to that microphone so that the people listening to this have any chance of hearing you.
Well, thanks so much. Is this on? Yeah. Okay, thanks so much. That was a really interesting talk. Yeah, my head is spinning a little bit too, and I guess I'm wondering, what prescriptive? I'm jumping to okay, great. What do we do? You've got, professors at another one university. We've got St. John's. We've got CUA. Different models of education. It seems like there's kind of a shared assumption that there are real human goods at stake here, and that they matter beyond whatever disciplinary silo we're a part of. I think that's a shared assumption. So what next? I mean, I guess you can podcast. I guess you can write popular books. I guess you can do all sorts of things. Maybe your little brother picks up a book you're reading, but those all seem to be going against the grain of the institutions that we're a part of, seems to me. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. So what now? I mean, what concrete thing? What do we dissolve the modern humanities? Do we just help the modern humanities to better articulate their own goods and hope for the best? And, German departments continue to consolidate and close down. Should we even be bothered?
I've resisted really giving any large-scale answer to this question. It's a question I get a lot, for the simple reason that I think that one of the ills that we suffer from in our institutions is thinking on too broad a scale, as if there's somehow like a 5-point plan that could be adopted by every institution that would somehow revive the humanities. And I don't think it's like that. And I'm very aware, and someone always reminds me whenever I start to forget, that there's a huge array of types of institutions in higher education, huge. So I feel kind of proud of myself because I've been to like 3 or 4 different kinds. But there's many more kinds. And each of those places is unique. They have unique communities, they have unique challenges, they have unique sets of students, they have unique people in there. So I honestly think that what needs to be done needs to be discerned in the moment, in real time, in a real place by the people who care about it. And what you see where you're sitting, I mean, my hope, my desperate hope, even though I haven't met anyone yet who's actually in this situation, there's someone who can actually be in a position to change their institution, institute a common core, for instance. That's something which there's funding to do, and which I think is it's just a little step, but it's something to have a common core at a public university or major university. One of the things I founded this thing called the Catherine Project, which is a nonprofit for adult education. I have to plug it a little bit. It's free, it's simple, it's no degrees, no grades, no tuition. And one of the things that shocked me is how many, I was thinking this would be for people who didn't have the opportunity to do this kind of learning, the people that are left out. How many academics come to us desperate for intellectual community and to be reminded of the meaning of what they're doing. And at first, we turned them away. And then after a while, I was like, you know what? A need is a need. So I think that rebuilding intellectual communities on your campus, where you are, is so crucial. It's so important. And in person, when you can. In person, substantive, not related to research. And just try to find for yourself, with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family, what you can.
I would just echo that, and it goes back to something, Zena, you said, and it's this question of who cares and who will care, like for the goods, the things that we love. And I found the exact same thing among my own faculty in Charlottesville. The intellectual desire, the sometimes abused, ill-formed, the Missbildung, right, as Nietzsche would say, of that was rampant. It was so sad, but also so energizing and hope-giving. And excuse me, but it really came back to that: who cares and who will care going forward. And so most curricular projects, in my experience, when I read, because I historicize everything, I read the last 20 years when every institution of higher education in the U.S. tried to undertake one of these big gen ed reforms, and they almost all were, quote, student focused. Within 2 months, it was like, oh, that's insane. The people who need help, the people who need each other, the people who can care because they're institutionalized are us. And so it was really that focusing on that corporate body, like the Universitas as a guild, right? We've forgotten our guild-like nature. And so its curricular form is always local. It's always about who is there to care over time and to shepherd those goods and then completely transform them. And it's totally political, right? In the highest and lowest sense of that term. And one last thing I would mention, because an analog, but not really, to the Catherine Project, and over the past 2 years, one of the most life-giving things I did was help start with kind of our School of Continuing Education, a liberal arts program for working adults who had some college credit, but not a BA, which is about 64 to 65% of the US population over 22, right? While the BA havers still hovers like in the 30s. Oh my word. I mean, it was completely liberating and an utter failure the first 2 weeks because I was using categories like philosophy and literature that read PhD, Whole Foods visiting, that read me. And then, but once I just brought, okay, we're just going to read Aristotle. We're just going to read Trisimum Millicatum. Then the intellectual desire got to flow in ways that I hadn't experienced, but it really was about community building then and there. And they learned their own idioms, they learned their own rhetoric, they had to respond to each other. And it was, again, like Zena's question, who's gonna care? For these goods that, however inarticulate they are, we can shape and craft together, but it's hard, inglorious work that doesn't show up on the annual report.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Can you walk to the... Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was great. All three of you, I admire your work. So my question is, all three of you kind of mentioned this, like who cares and who will care? I'm an undergraduate student here at CUA, so this is something that I see a lot amongst my peers and something that I'm grateful here at CUA, that studying philosophy, I have a lot of great, super engaged peers. But kind of like with your experience, like how do we engage students? Because we might have like this intellectual concern, like are the humanities in crises? But like on a practical level, like is it within like this academic realm, or is there a problem within the students as well? Like the students coming to the universities, of course, I think that there's a problem like the high schools too, but yeah, like what can the students, like the quote unquote quality of the students maybe, what role does that play in contributing to this crisis and ultimately improving from it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, in my experience, the problem actually isn't so much the students, it's the parents. The parents are the ones paying the tuition bills. The tuition bills are very high. And what I see is students who want to study philosophy and say, mom wants me in the business school, dad wants me in the business school. And the way that my university is structured as an institution, if you are in the business school, it is almost impossible for you to be a philosophy major. And that is by design, right? And when you really sit back and reflect on that, it tells you a lot about my university and the way that it has understood itself and the way that it understands an education. And so I don't really think it's so much the students, but I mean, I understand. I mean, I have 6 kids and I'm looking at like college and I'm just like, oh, I don't know, maybe you could be a welder. It seems like a very noble profession. So I understand why parents feel this pressure to get a very good return on their investment. And they do see it as an investment because the reality is it's a huge investment they're making. But I think that, it's a cultural crisis in a way, right? I mean, we don't value the goods at stake. We don't value them in primary education. We don't value them in, so they come, so everyone's in this position now where they have no idea why you would study philosophy. It seems really weird, right? And there's no like elevator pitch I can give them because it takes a certain habit of mind, I think, or way of seeing the world to even enter into that conversation in a productive way. Now, practically speaking, what I have found is that you have to meet people on a very personal level. And something that I've been able to do since I have tenure is to really invest myself in my students in a way that I didn't before, really invest in them as human beings, as persons, which means spending time with them and listening to them and kind of being like a second mom to them, and getting them, to read St. Augustine, for example, not for a class. We just meet on a Sunday and we read the Confessions. And it's surprising in our Thomistic Institute, gonna plug the Thomistic Institute. Father Aquinas left, but Thomistic Institute, we have these Thomistic Institute reading groups where the majority of the people in the reading group are in the nursing school or in the business school or in real estate. You can major in real estate. So ridiculous. I'm sorry to all the real estate majors. I love you, and you're wonderful.
UVA just got a giant gift to start a real estate.
I bet they did. So we get together, and we have been reading the Confessions, and it's just an incredibly powerful experience for all of us, including me. And it's that kind of thing, right? You have to provide the opportunities for people to discover this, and it takes time. I wish there was, but there's no elevator pitch. There's no pamphlet that really brings them into this. They have to come to see the good in some sense by experiencing it. And the tragedy is that they have gone through 12 years of education without really loving learning. So that tells you something about our education system, but that's a different obsession. Yeah.
Just a story that is ongoing, and it's actually with my 18-year-old, who so my wife, his mom, studied Shakespeare, thought she was going to be a Shakespeare scholar until she actually met graduate students when we were at Berkeley, and then I like to read, so she decided not to do that. And so he's now 18. He just applied to college. He's a senior, and he's going to go off to college. My anxiety almost his entire life was twofold. One, most importantly, he wasn't a jock. Just to be honest, that's my lack of virtue, because I was played sports. That's what I did. But he didn't like to read, and that for his parents, that was. My wife is just a better person, so she was able to love him regardless. Me, I'm not. It took me 17 and a half years to, I think, actually love, and love him in the way my wife loved him, which was open and ready for surprise and ready to learn who he actually was. Because for the past, since he was in 6th grade, in Charlottesville, he has been obsessed, with engineering, and we have these amazing engineering labs, and he builds the most. You've probably seen him on my Twitter feed, the things that this kid builds. And so he got a job at Wellmon's during the first month of the pandemic so he could support his habit of building these insane things. It took me watching him and him literally down in the basement at 2 a.m., we're all locked, in the first 6 months of the thing, showing me what he had built and why he had built it. And the way he talked about his latest drift trike was one of the first things he built the engine and everything. The way he talked about that was the way I talked about Nietzsche when I was, or Kafka. And then I think, so love and trust has a lot to do with it. And also, not to rag on the philosophers, is that I see my son, he practices engineering as a liberal art. And also when you go, and so I've been writing to try to make sense of this, when you read about the history of MIT and all these engineering institutions, they compare their technical training and what they want to do, they call them disciplines of the mind. But instead of reading, and parsing Greek verbs, they're attending to mechanical processes that they claim have just as an intellectually formative power as these other things. And so that's a circuitous route back to your question. But to me, it took 17 and a half years to see the capaciousness of the liberalness of learning and the forms that it can take. And it, unfortunately for my son, it was manifested in him in our relationship, but everybody else is going to benefit from it. So, he's good. To me, that love and that capaciousness to see the goods that Zena and Jen are talking about in so many ways, which makes all the sense in the world given, the order of the cosmos, it would be in so many more ways and forms than we can manage in our institutions.
So I'll just say one quick thing, and I'm sorry, I see the other questions. Just the one quick thing, just because both of these, I totally am on board with everything they said, but they are both from the perspective of adults. I just want to say, you young people, you have so much power over your own life and over the lives of your friends. It's so simple. All you need to do is get together with one or two other people and read a book and have conversations that are open-ended, without an agenda, without a resume thing. And it makes a huge difference. But I think it's one of the diseases of our culture is this sense of passivity. It's like, when is this going to happen? And we all have choices, and you can do it. You can do it yourself with one or two other people. And once you get in the habit of it, you'll see how much better it is to live that way. So I just want to encourage you you don't have to wait for one of us to reach out to you. Just do it.
Because college starts in kindergarten now, right? The long slog.
Oh my gosh.
Right? Of being disciplined and reprimanded into excellence starts in kindergarten.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm just mindful of the time. And so there's going to be plenty of time to chat after it's sort of like officially over, but I'm just going to take the liberty, since it's my podcast, of giving myself the last word. And well, first of all, to thank again, Zena and Chad for joining us. Because I really do feel like I've understood your book better now. And I'm also like clarifying my own thoughts. My own thoughts are becoming more articulate as a result of this conversation. But I guess just my final thought, the thing that I came to see too late, in some sense, it's never too late, is this idea that, and this is something that your book really, really clarified for me in a way, and that is that the intellectual life is stifled when it becomes competitive, when it becomes about your ambitions. And it's very, very hard for professors especially to confront this in a really honest way, because our whole profession is about how ambitious we can be, how quickly we can go up the academic ladder. It's not the same as the corporate ladder, but there is a ladder there. And it is a place, the academy has become a place of domination and ambition. And I don't mean ambition in the positive sense that you're ambitious to find the truth. I mean ambitious in the really, the sense that you want to be superior, you want to be better than other people. And I think that what all of us should be reflecting about, all of us in higher education, is thinking about how we can recover a spirit of cooperation, right? That we are after the same good. It's a common good. A common good shouldn't be competitive, right? And the extent to which we get honors and promotions is fine. I've just got a promotion and I was very pleased about it. So it's not bad in itself. What becomes bad or disordered is when you lose sight of the fact that we are after a common good. I would call that common good truth without apology. We are coming at that common good from our own disciplinary perspectives. But if it's really a common good, then it's something that we share, right? That we participate in together. And I think Aristotle is so good at articulating this kind of good. And he constructs his whole account of friendship around this idea of a common good as the good shared between friends. And we have lost, it seems to me, the most important thing, which is intellectual friendship. As the university is the space where you really cultivate intellectual friendships, right? Which is a distinctive and completely wonderful kind of friendship, right? Which Zena and I talk about in episode 6 of this podcast, and you should listen to. And I think that if that message we're getting to students, right, that the university is a place where you come to build a distinctive kind of rewarding friendship, that would be something meaningful. So with that, I guess we're done. I don't really know. I don't know how to close out a live episode. So I'm just going to remark that there are cookies and refreshments and some things in the back, and we can continue the conversation, but not officially as part of the podcast.
Thanks.